Right now, somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a quiet revolution is unfolding that could reshape global energy markets, trigger trillion-dollar economic shockwaves, and fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East. What if I told you that Iran's legendary grip on the world's most critical oil chokepoint, the Strait of Hormuz, is quietly crumbling from within, not through military confrontation, but through a strategic bypass so elegant that most governments haven't even acknowledged it exists? By the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly what's happening, why it matters, and what 3 specific indicators you need to watch this week. The Strait of Hormuz is essentially the world's most important traffic jam. Every day, roughly 20% of the planet's oil supply passes through this narrow waterway between Oman and Iran, a passage so narrow that tankers literally cannot avoid each other when crossing. For decades, Iran has leveraged this geography like a locked gate on a private highway. Threaten to close it, and the world listens. Sanctions tighten? Threaten the strait. Negotiations stall? Threaten the strait. The pattern has been consistent. Hormuz equals leverage, leverage equals power, and power equals the ability to reshape behavior. But here's what the headlines aren't telling you: that leverage is eroding faster than anyone expected, and the mechanism behind its decline is neither a military operation nor a diplomatic breakthrough. It's a network of alternative routes designed specifically to make Iran's strait threats obsolete. Understanding why this matters requires a quick trip to your local gas station. When oil supply chains are disrupted, prices spike. When prices spike, everything costs more, from the food on your table to the products in your store to the commute that gets you to work. For decades, this direct connection between Hormuz stability and your monthly expenses has been a geopolitical fact of life. Iran understood this perfectly, and so did every major power. The strait was insurance for Iran's negotiating position, a guarantee that its concerns would always receive attention because the alternative, disruption, carried catastrophic economic consequences. But what happens when that insurance expires? What happens when nations build alternative routes that render the strait's strategic importance diminished? That's not just an academic question, my friend. That's a question with direct implications for your financial future, your country's energy policy, and the stability of a region where millions of people are already living through conflict. The answer to those questions is what we're about to explore together. The secret corridor I'm referring to isn't a physical tunnel or a hidden waterway. It refers to the constellation of oil export routes, infrastructure investments, and diplomatic arrangements that have emerged over the past decade specifically to reduce reliance on Hormuz. Think of it like a neighborhood building an alternative road so they no longer depend on a single bridge controlled by an unfriendly neighbor. These alternatives include expanded pipeline networks through countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, new export terminals in places that historically relied on Hormuz transit, and strategic storage facilities that allow importing nations to weather short-term disruptions. None of this is secret in the intelligence community sense, but the cumulative strategic effect is rarely discussed in mainstream analysis because it represents a slow-moving transformation rather than a dramatic headline. Consider what has happened in just the past 5 years. Major Asian oil consumers, nations like China, India, Japan, and South Korea, have quietly diversified their import sources and developed contingency plans that assume Hormuz disruption scenarios. They have invested in longer-term storage contracts, negotiated preferential treatment with alternative suppliers, and built pipelines that can redirect flows if needed. This isn't paranoia, it's prudent risk management. But from Iran's perspective, this gradual diversification represents a direct assault on its core strategic asset. When the threat to close Hormuz once meant global economic panic, Iran could extract concessions from major powers. Now, with alternative routes partially operational, the threat carries less weight. Some analysts estimate that Iran's ability to cause lasting disruption has decreased by nearly a third compared to just a decade ago. That number might not sound dramatic, but in geopolitical terms, it represents a fundamental shift in the balance of leverage. What makes this development particularly significant is its timing. Iran is currently navigating a complex web of international pressure, economic sanctions, and regional tensions. The nuclear negotiations that have consumed diplomatic energy for years are stalled in critical phases. Regional rivals are deepening their cooperation, creating a diplomatic, an encirclement that makes Iran's traditional response options less effective. And in the background, the global energy transition is accelerating, creating long-term uncertainty about whether oil choke points will maintain their strategic significance. Each of these pressures compounds the others, creating a situation where Iran's traditional playbook becomes less reliable precisely when the country needs maximum leverage most. But here is what many analysts miss. This corridor isn't just about reducing Iran's power. It's about fundamentally restructuring who holds influence over global energy flows. The countries building these alternatives aren't doing so out of altruism or concern for global stability. They are positioning themselves to become the new indispensable partners, the nations that importing countries will need to court regardless of what happens in Tehran. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and even certain Central Asian states are investing heavily in export infrastructure specifically because they understand that the old equilibrium centered on Hormuz is being replaced by a new one centered on diversification. This creates interesting dynamics. Iran isn't simply losing power, it's being replaced by a coalition of nations whose interests may align differently with importing countries. Here is where I need you to pay close attention, because this is the part that changes everything. One overlooked detail that most coverage misses is that Iran's response to this erosion has been paradoxical. Rather than accepting diminished leverage and adapting strategy, Iranian decision-makers have actually intensified their threats against Hormuz, often in direct proportion to how much leverage they are losing. Intelligence assessments suggest this represents a classic escalation trap. When your deterrent becomes less effective, the temptation is to demonstrate resolve by making more dramatic threats, which in turn accelerates your opponent's efforts to reduce reliance on you. This creates a vicious cycle where the very actions meant to maintain relevance actually increase the urgency of the alternatives you are trying to prevent. Why does this pattern matter for understanding where things are heading? Because it suggests we are approaching a critical decision point. Iran cannot maintain indefinitely a strategy that relies on threats that carry diminishing weight. At some point, the country's leadership will need to either accept a reduced strategic position, something historically difficult for Iranian political culture, or take actions designed to demonstrate that the Strait threat remains credible. That demonstration could range from military exercises and displays of capability to actual interference with shipping, each carrying escalating risks of miscalculation. What happens at that decision point will likely define regional dynamics for the next decade. If you find this breakdown useful, please subscribe now and turn on notifications. We track these developments in real time, and the next update could fundamentally change the picture we're building together. The story we're unpacking isn't just about oil routes and strategic positioning. It's about how power actually works when the foundations beneath it shift. Now let's go deeper into what's really driving these changes and what they mean for the future. The historical context here is essential, and it reveals how we arrived at this moment. When the Islamic Republic came to power in 1979, one of its first acts was to seize control of key islands in the Persian Gulf, establishing a forward military presence that could threaten any passage through Hormuz. This was deliberate strategic thinking: control the geography, control the leverage. Through the 1980s, during the brutal Iran-Iraq War, both sides attacked each other's oil infrastructure, and the world learned exactly how sensitive global energy markets were to disruption in this region. The experience cemented Hormuz's reputation as a critical choke point, and Iran's geographic position as indispensable to any solution. By the 1990s, even as international sanctions tightened against Iran, the country's negotiators understood that their Hormuz position guaranteed them a seat at any table where regional or energy issues were discussed. What changed beginning in the early 2000s was the convergence of multiple factors. American military presence in the Gulf expanded dramatically following the September 11th attacks, and the invasion of Iraq removed Iran's primary regional rival from effective action. Rather than consolidating Iran's position, this actually accelerated strategic planning by other nations to reduce exposure to Gulf disruption. The 2006 Lebanon War and subsequent regional tensions demonstrated that instability was persistent, not temporary. Climate concerns and energy transition planning entered mainstream policy discussions, creating long-term uncertainty about oil's centrality. Most importantly, the economic rise of Asian nations, particularly China, created new centers of demand that were less tied to Western-dominated energy infrastructure and more willing to invest in alternatives. Now consider the position from Iran's perspective. The country has watched over 2 decades as alternative export routes have proliferated, as importing nations have developed contingency plans, and as regional rivals have positioned themselves as indispensable alternatives. Each step in this process has reduced Iran's margin for diplomatic error, narrowed the range of effective threats, and complicated the task of maintaining deterrence. The paradox is that Iran actually has become more rather than less capable militarily, in many respects. Yet this increased capability hasn't translated into proportionally increased strategic leverage because the fundamental premise that Hormuz control guarantees influence has been partially undermined. What would happen if Iran actually attempted to close or seriously disrupt the Strait today? The military scenario is instructive. The Islamic Republic's Revolutionary Guard Corps possesses significant naval capabilities, including fast attack craft, sea mines, and anti-ship missiles. Any serious disruption attempt would require confronting not just American military presence, but also the naval forces of regional allies who depend on Gulf stability. The economic retaliation would be swift and severe, potentially collapsing whatever remains of Iran's international trade. And most critically, the strategic effect would be less than in previous decades because importing nations have built the capacity to withstand disruption, at least for limited periods. This doesn't mean the threat is hollow. Any disruption would cause significant market volatility and price spikes. But it does mean the historical certainty of catastrophic consequences has been partially replaced by manageable costs. Here's the scenario that keeps regional specialists up at night. What if Iranian decision-makers conclude that the only way to restore credibility is through direct demonstration rather than mere threat? The escalation ladder is well understood in military theory. Start with demonstrations, move to limited actions, escalate to signal resolve, and potentially reach points of no return where backing down becomes impossible. If Iran were to take physical action against shipping, even a limited incident, importing nations would accelerate their diversification efforts dramatically. The very action meant to demonstrate power would accelerate the erosion of that power, potentially creating a spiral that becomes difficult to exit. This dynamic is what makes the current period so dangerous. The rational response to losing leverage is to demonstrate resolve, but that demonstration carries risks that could make the loss of leverage permanent. Some observers suggest that Iran has already recognized this dynamic and is adapting its strategy accordingly. Rather than relying on Hormuz as a blunt instrument, Iranian planners may be shifting toward more sophisticated approaches, cultivating relationships with alternative energy providers, developing asymmetric capabilities that complicate military response, and positioning itself as a necessary partner in any Gulf security architecture. This would represent a fundamental strategic pivot, trading coercive leverage for cooperative influence. Whether Iranian leadership is capable of making that pivot, whether the political culture permits accepting diminished status, is a question without a clear answer. But here's what the data suggests. Iran has historically been remarkably adaptable when it comes to strategic positioning. The country survived international isolation for decades by finding creative workarounds, developing relationships with non-Western powers, and maintaining internal cohesion through external pressure. If that adaptive capacity extends to the current situation, the era of Hormuz as Iran's primary source of leverage may not end in dramatic confrontation, but in gradual managed transition to a different kind of regional role. Whether that transition is peaceful or violent depends on factors that remain uncertain, including the decisions of external actors who may or may not choose to pressure Iran during its period of strategic vulnerability. What does this mean for you, the viewer tracking these developments? Several concrete indicators deserve attention in the coming weeks. First, watch for any announcements of new pipeline projects or export terminal developments from Gulf Cooperation Council states. These represent the physical infrastructure of the bypass corridor and will signal how quickly the alternative routes are being completed. Second, monitor statements from major Asian importers about their energy security planning. These often contain coded messages about how seriously they take disruption scenarios. Third, pay attention to naval activity in the Persian Gulf, particularly any incidents involving the Revolutionary Guard Corps and commercial shipping, because these represent potential tripwires for escalation. Third, watch for changes in insurance rates for Gulf shipping. The Lloyd's of London market and similar insurers are often the first to signal increased risk, and their pricing reflects the informed judgment of professionals who track these dynamics constantly. A spike in premiums without an obvious cause suggests intelligence assessments have changed. Fourth, monitor the timing and content of Iranian military exercises, particularly any that include closures of maritime corridors or interference with navigation. These are calibrated signals, and their frequency and intensity reveal decision-making within Tehran. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Iran will accept its reduced strategic position, or will we see escalating demonstrations of resolve in the coming months? Your perspective helps us all understand this faster. While you're thinking about that, consider this next piece of the puzzle, because the story doesn't end with Iran and the Strait. There's a larger contest for the future of global energy governance unfolding that will determine whether any single nation can hold strategic leverage over critical infrastructure in the decades ahead. The truth is that the corridor undermining Iran's Hormuz power represents something larger than a bilateral dispute. It reflects the broader transformation of global energy governance from a system of geographic choke points to a network of distributed alternatives. This transformation isn't complete and it isn't inevitable, but it is underway in ways that will reshape international relations for a generation. Countries that understand this shift and position themselves accordingly will gain influence. Those that cling to outdated strategic models will find their power eroding in ways they cannot reverse. And ordinary people everywhere, the consumers at gas stations, the commuters who need affordable transport, the workers in industries that depend on stable energy prices, will feel the consequences either way. Looking at possible futures, the most likely scenario involves continued erosion of Iran's Hormuz leverage, combined with periodic attempts to demonstrate capability and restore credibility. This likely means more military exercises, more threats, and more incidents, short of actual confrontation. The worst-case scenario involves a miscalculated escalation, where limited action leads to disproportionate response, triggering a cycle that neither side can control. The wildcard possibility is a dramatic diplomatic breakthrough where Iran trades acceptance of reduced leverage for integration into regional economic frameworks, fundamentally changing the equation. Here's what you need to monitor this week: the status of current nuclear negotiations, any naval incidents in the strait itself, and statements from Asian importing nations about their energy planning. Each of these provides a window into the decision-making happening behind closed doors, and each could change the entire picture we're analyzing. The corridor is real, its effects are measurable, and its implications extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. Understanding it isn't just about geopolitics. It's about understanding how the world you live in is being reshaped by forces invisible to most people, but operating with profound consequences for everyone. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe for our next deep dive. We are already tracking the next development in this ongoing story, and it could change everything we thought we understood about power, leverage, and the future of the world's most important waterway. The Strait of Hormuz has been a strategic focal point for half a century. The forces now undermining Iran's exclusive leverage over it won't stop their work simply because the change is uncomfortable for some parties. Whether that change leads to stability or crisis depends on the choices of people who are watching these dynamics closely. People like you, who now have the context to understand why this matters and what to look for next.